They never saw it coming. A Soviet T-34, roaring through the smoke of the battlefield, was supposed to be unstoppable. Its sloped armor shrugged off most German shells, its engine clawed forward through mud and snow, and its crew had been told it could smash through any line. But then, at over 2 kilometers away, well beyond what they thought possible, an invisible thunderclap split the air. The shell hit like a steel fist. In less than a second, the tank was a burning coffin. For 3 out of every 4 Soviet tank crews in World War II, that was how it ended. And one of the main reasons was the German 88. By the mid-1930s, Germany was breaking the chains of the Treaty of Versailles with a precision that alarmed its neighbors. Officially, they weren't allowed to develop new tanks, aircraft, or heavy guns. Unofficially, engineers were already sketching designs that would push warfare into a new era. Air power was evolving quickly, and it wasn't just biplanes anymore. Strategic bombers were climbing higher and carrying payloads that could erase entire city blocks. To bring them down, Germany needed something far deadlier than the small, low-caliber anti-aircraft guns of the past. The solution was born under layers of secrecy and deception. The 8.8 centimeter Flak 18. Flak came from the German Flugabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft cannon. But that word would soon gain a life of its own, becoming a byword for any withering wall of fire. The 88's design was brutally efficient. It could hurl a 10-kilo shell at nearly 2,700 feet per second, timed to explode at precise altitudes and shred bomber formations with a storm of high-speed steel fragments. Mounted on a cruciform carriage, it could rotate and elevate quickly, tracking targets from low strafing runs to the upper reaches of the sky. At first, its role was simple: kill bombers. A well-trained crew of 10 could deploy or pack it up in minutes, and its range, over 26,000 feet vertically, meant that no Allied bomber was truly safe. The gun's semi-automatic sliding block breech allowed up to 20 rounds per minute, a terrifying volume of fire when multiplied across an entire battery. But that was just the beginning. The Spanish Civil War, a testing ground for many of Hitler's weapons, revealed something unexpected. The 88 didn't just tear planes out of the sky. It could obliterate bunkers, infantry positions, and most alarmingly, tanks. At a time when armor plating was thin and crude compared to what was coming, a high-velocity hit from the 88 left nothing but wreckage. Still, few in the German high command realized just how important that would become. By 1939, Germany had around 2,600 of these guns, more than twice the number Britain had of its best anti-aircraft weapons, while the United States had virtually none. Once the war began, production ramped up to over 21,000 units of various models. With each iteration, Flak 36, Flak 37, the gun became more lethal. Longer barrels increased muzzle velocity, modular construction allowed quick replacement of worn parts, and armored shields gave crews a fighting chance against counterfire. But the real killer feature was its fire control system. While most nations relied on manual aiming, the Germans linked their 88s to a central mechanical analog computer that processed data from rangefinders, acoustic locators, and eventually radar. Crews in the control center could calculate a target's speed, altitude, and trajectory, then feed that data to every gun in the battery simultaneously. It was complex, it was fast, and it was deadly accurate. Allied crews would later recall the dread of flying into a wall of black puffs, where each cloud carried thousands of lethal fragments. Against aircraft, the 88 was already feared. But it was the land war that would give it its grim reputation among Soviet tank crews. In the early years of the Eastern Front, Standard German anti-tank guns struggled against the heavy armor of new Soviet designs. The T-34 and KV-1 could shrug off hits from 37mm and even 50mm weapons. But an 88 firing an armor-piercing round? That was a different story. High muzzle velocity meant the shell flew flat and fast, striking with such force that it could pierce up to 100 millimeters of armor at 2 kilometers. And thanks to superior optics, the crews could hit targets long before those targets could fire back. The Eastern Front's wide-open terrain made the 88 an executioner's weapon. Invisible at range, unmissable when it fired. Soviet tank units advancing with confidence could be gutted in minutes, their burning hulks littering the steppe. The price for manning these guns was high. By the war's midpoint, 88 crews were prime targets for everything from strafing fighters to Soviet artillery. Positions were often exposed, dug in hastily, or set up in open fields. Casualty rates soared, 50 to 70% by the later years. But as long as they had a working gun, they could dictate the battle. And this was only the first act of the 88's transformation. What began as an anti-aircraft cannon was evolving into a tank killer, so feared that Allied tank commanders were trained to assume any German position might hide one. The Soviet crews who didn't often never made it home. Before we dive deeper, subscribe, like, and leave a comment about where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the battlefield. Eastern Front, summer 1941. Operation Barbarossa is in full swing. The German advance is lightning fast, swallowing towns and railways, encircling entire Soviet armies. But in the chaos, something begins to slow the blitz. Reports come in from panzer divisions. Our guns can't penetrate their new tanks. The name starts spreading: T-34, KV-1. These weren't the lumbering, thin-skinned machines of Poland or France. They had thick, sloped armor, powerful 76mm guns, and engines that could keep going even when riddled with shrapnel. At first, German crews fired everything they had. The 37mm Pak guns, nicknamed door knockers by frustrated soldiers, just bounced shells off the T-34's armor. The heavier 50mm Pak 38 fared little better. And when the KV-1 appeared, its armor was so thick that entire battalions reported situations where no weapon in the field could stop it. That was when orders came down: bring in the 88s. The change in the fight was immediate. At ranges Soviet gunners thought were safe, 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, the 88s cracked through their armor with brutal efficiency. Armor-piercing shells like the Panzergranate 39 exploded inside the tank after penetration, turning confined interiors into death traps. Even if the shot didn't detonate fuel or ammunition, fragments and overpressure could kill the crew in seconds. Crews of the 88 learned to set up kill zones, long stretches of open steppe, valley mouths, or the approaches to bridges. Camouflaged under netting or hidden in tree lines, the gun would stay silent until Soviet armor rolled into range. The first hit often struck the lead tank, halting the column. The second and third hits targeted the rear, boxing the rest in. What followed was a slaughter. German infantry and lighter anti-tank guns could then move in to finish off survivors. The Battle of Dubno in June 1941 was one of the first large-scale tank clashes of the war. Over 3,000 Soviet tanks against just a fraction of that number of German panzers. In many sectors, it was the 88s that made the difference. In open fields, they knocked out dozens of Soviet tanks in a single afternoon, buying critical time for German armor to maneuver. By winter, the Eastern Front had become a brutal grind. Temperatures dropped so low that oil congealed and steel became brittle. For Soviet crews, cold was an enemy, but so was the silent presence of the 88. The snow muffled its firing position, and its flat trajectory meant the shell arrived almost before it could be heard. Veterans recalled the haunting effect. One flash in the distance, then your tank is gone. The Germans adapted the gun even further. Mounting the 88 on half-tracks or specially built carriages made it faster to deploy and withdraw before counter-battery fire could find it. And soon, the weapon became the main armament of the Tiger I heavy tank. In the Tiger's turret, the Kalka 36 version of the 88 retained its devastating range and accuracy. For Soviet tankers, this was the ultimate nightmare. An armored vehicle that could kill them before they even spotted it. In the open fields around Leningrad, in the forests near Vyazma, and later in the vast tank battles around Kharkov, the same pattern repeated. The Soviets pushed forward in waves, sometimes overwhelming in numbers, only to have their spearheads cut to pieces by a handful of well-placed 88s. Survivors spoke of burning wrecks stretching across the horizon, of tank hatches fused shut by heat, of the desperate scramble to escape as ammunition cooked off. But the cost for the Germans was steep. The moment an 88 opened fire, it became the top priority target. Soviet artillery batteries would shift their fire instantly. Infantry units would radio for IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes to strafe the position. Flak crews fought knowing that every shot gave away their location, and every reload could be their last. Despite the danger, the crews kept firing. Many were young, barely trained replacements brought in to fill the gaps left by losses. Others were veterans with the precision and calm that only months of combat could teach. They learned to time their shots between artillery salvos, to fire and relocate under smoke cover, and to work in pairs so one gun could engage while the other reloaded or shifted position. By late 1942, the Soviet Union had learned to respect the 88 and to hunt it. Tank units advanced in zigzag formations, artillery barrages preceded assaults, and reconnaissance flights searched for the telltale cruciform shadow of the gun's carriage. But even with these measures, the 88's kill count kept climbing. For the Soviet crews who faced it, the odds were grim. Statistically, 3 out of 4 would never make it back from the battlefield. And for many, their final moments were defined by a flash in the distance, a deafening impact, and the sudden, total end of everything. The Eastern Front was far from over, and the 88 was just getting started. Summer 1943. The Eastern Front had stabilized into a line stretching hundreds of kilometers, but both sides were preparing for a single, massive blow. For the Germans, Operation Citadel was their chance to encircle and destroy a huge concentration of Soviet forces around the Kursk salient. They brought their best. Tiger I heavy tanks, new Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, and, supporting them at key points, the dreaded 88mm guns. For months, the Soviets knew the attack was coming. Their reconnaissance flights spotted the armored buildup, intercepted radio chatter, and mapped German assembly areas. In response, they constructed one of the most formidable defensive systems in history. Deep minefields, anti-tank ditches, trenches, and thousands of gun emplacements. And somewhere behind these defenses, Soviet tank brigades waited, ready to counterattack the moment the German spearheads blunted. In this kind of battle, the 88 would be both hunter and hunted. Positioned on ridge lines and behind natural cover, German crews used their long range to target Soviet armor before it crossed minefields. The flat trajectory and velocity of the gun meant they could hit a moving T-34 even at extreme distances. Sometimes before Soviet gunners even knew where the fire was coming from. At the northern face of the salient, in the fields near Poniri, the 88s operated almost like snipers. Camouflaged in haystacks, dug into barns, or hidden behind railway embankments, they waited for advancing Soviet armor. The first volley often disabled the lead tanks, forcing the rest to maneuver in predictable ways. Every movement brought them into pre-sighted kill zones. In the south, the story was bloodier. Around the village of Prokhorovka, where some of the fiercest tank fighting of the war erupted, the 88s were less protected. Soviet armor surged forward at close range, and the flat fields left the guns exposed. Crews fought desperately, loading and firing as quickly as possible while Soviet shells ripped into their positions. Many were overrun or destroyed in place, but not before exacting a toll that stalled entire battalions. The German plan relied heavily on the 88's ability to break through Soviet tank lines and open paths for the Tigers and Panthers. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, essentially 88mm PaK-43s mounted on heavy chassis, were designed for this very role. On paper, their frontal armor was invulnerable to most Soviet guns, and their cannons could knock out a T-34 from over 3 kilometers away. But in reality, they lacked machine guns for close defense, and Soviet infantry quickly learned to swarm them with grenades and Molotov cocktails once they were disabled or immobilized. At Kursk, the Soviets threw everything they had to counter the 88's advantage. They concentrated artillery fire on suspected gun positions, sent low-flying Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft to strafe and rocket the sites, and used the terrain to close the range quickly. In some sectors, they advanced under smoke screens, denying German gunners clear sight lines. Yet even with these measures, the 88 remained a threat every Soviet tanker feared. Eyewitness accounts from Prokhorovka describe burning tanks littering the fields, their turrets blown off by internal explosions after 88mm hits. Survivors talked about the eerie precision of the German fire, how shells seemed to arrive exactly where they were trying to maneuver, as if the gunners could read their minds. In reality, it was skill, discipline, and the advanced optics and range-finding equipment paired with the 88 that made such shots possible. Despite its effectiveness, the 88 could not change the overall outcome. The Soviet defenses held, their reserves counterattacked, and the German offensive ground to a halt. The Battle of Kursk became a turning point. After it, Germany would never again take the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. But in tactical terms, the 88 left its mark. On certain days of the battle, individual guns were credited with destroying over a dozen tanks before being silenced. In the months that followed, the weapon's role continued to evolve. Mobile versions on the Tiger tank and Nashorn tank destroyer allowed it to operate more flexibly, striking Soviet armor and withdrawing before retaliation. Fixed batteries remained in use to defend key points. But by late 1943, the Red Army's growing artillery and air superiority meant that static 88 positions rarely survived long. Still, every Soviet tank crew approaching a contested sector knew that somewhere out there, beyond the haze and the smoke, an 88 might be waiting. And for 3 out of 4, that unseen gun would decide whether they ever made it home. By 1944, the Soviet war machine was advancing relentlessly westward. But the 88 was not finished yet. In the battles for Belarus, Poland, and East Prussia, it would continue to strike with deadly precision, even as Germany itself began to crumble. By 1944, the tide had turned completely. The Red Army, hardened by 3 brutal years of war, was rolling west with unstoppable momentum. The Soviets now had not just numbers, but better tactics, better coordination, and tanks like the T-34-85 and IS-2 that could take far more punishment than their earlier models. Against this tide, the 80mm gun remained one of the few German weapons still capable of inflicting fearsome losses. But now, it was fighting a defensive war under constant pressure. Everywhere, the strategic map looked worse for Germany. In Belarus, Operation Bagration shattered Army Group Center. Hundreds of kilometers of front collapsed in weeks, and the retreating German forces had to buy every hour they could to avoid complete encirclement. The 88s became rearguard executioners, set up on crossroads, bridgeheads, or ridges to delay Soviet armor just long enough for infantry and supply columns to escape. These were no longer the clean, calculated ambushes of 1941. By now, Soviet reconnaissance aircraft scoured the terrain ahead of every major push. Once an 88 opened fire, its position was marked for immediate destruction by artillery or IL-2 ground attack aircraft. The average lifespan of a fixed gun in heavy combat zones was measured in hours, sometimes minutes. Crews adapted by firing a handful of shots, then abandoning the position before the inevitable counterstrike arrived. In Poland and the Baltics, the 88 was often mounted on the back of half-tracks or hidden in barns and factory ruins. Urban fighting brought its own challenges. The long barrel was hard to maneuver in tight streets, and rubble made repositioning nearly impossible. But in the right position, the gun was still lethal. In Warsaw, during the 1944 uprising, German forces used 88s to smash fortified buildings and Soviet-supplied armored vehicles with terrifying precision. By late 1944, the Tiger Y was no longer the undisputed king of the battlefield, but its 80mm KWK-36 still commanded respect. On the open plains of East Prussia, Tigers engaged Soviet armor at extreme ranges, knocking out IS-2s before they could close to effective distance. The heavier Tiger II, armed with the even more powerful KWK-43, essentially a PaK-43 version of the 88, could penetrate any Soviet tank frontally at over 2 kilometers. Yet these behemoths were few in number, plagued by mechanical problems, and often destroyed by air attack before they could make a difference. For the crews of towed 88s, the late war period was hell. Ammunition was scarce, fuel shortages slowed redeployment, and many gun positions were manned by barely trained replacements. Teenagers, older reservists, and convalescents pulled from hospitals. Veterans knew the odds. A single hit from a 122mm shell could obliterate the entire crew. A strafing run by a flight of Yak-9s could wipe out an emplacement in seconds. Yet they stayed, because without their fire, Soviet armor would rip through German lines even faster. In East Prussia, January 1945, an 88 battery held a frozen causeway across the Masurian lakes. For 2 days, they repelled repeated Soviet armored thrusts, destroying over 30 vehicles before the last gun was silenced by direct tank fire. Survivors described the final hours as chaos. Snow whipped into blinding sheets, the air thick with cordite and smoke, the frozen lake littered with burning wrecks. When Soviet infantry finally crossed, they found the guns still in position, their barrels scorched, the crews either dead or too wounded to move. Inside Germany itself, the 88 became part of fortress defenses. In Königsberg, Danzig, and later Berlin, the guns were dug into street intersections or mounted on the flak towers that loomed over the cities. These towers, built of reinforced concrete meters thick, housed heavy anti-aircraft batteries, including twin-mounted 128mm guns. But 88s played a crucial role against low-flying aircraft and, when Soviet armor approached, as direct fire weapons against tanks trying to penetrate the city. In the final months, Soviet troops advancing through Brandenburg encountered desperate pockets of resistance, where 88s, supported by a few remaining panzers, turned city blocks into killing grounds. IS-2 crews learned to avoid certain avenues, knowing they were likely zeroed in by concealed guns. Even so, the outcome was inevitable. The 88 could destroy tanks, but it could not stop an army. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. In the last battles, 88s fired at point-blank range down rubble-strewn streets, their barrels glowing red from continuous fire. Crews fought until ammunition was gone, then used their guns as barricades. In many cases, the Soviets simply bypassed stubborn positions, sealing them off until the fighting ended. The weapon that had once been a symbol of German dominance was now a relic of a war Germany had already lost. But for Soviet tank crews, even in those final days, the sight, or even the suspicion, of an 88 ahead still triggered the same instinct. Find cover, or you won't be going home. The war was over. In May 1945, the last echoes of artillery faded, and Europe lay in ruins. The 80mm gun, once feared, admired, and cursed in equal measure, now stood abandoned in fields, streets, and factory yards. Many were still loaded, barrels scorched from their final bursts of fire. Some were toppled by demolition charges, others left upright, silent and useless, their cruciform mounts sinking into the mud. For the Soviets, these captured weapons were trophies. Crews who had survived the war often sought them out, walking around their cold steel, touching the armor-piercing rounds that had claimed so many of their comrades. Engineers examined them, learning from their design, and in some cases integrating ideas into their own post-war anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems. But for the tankers who had fought against them, the memory was not technical. It was visceral. The 88 was not just a gun. It was the invisible hand that had reached out across kilometers and ended lives without warning. The statistics were staggering. On the Eastern Front alone, German 88mm guns, both towed and vehicle-mounted, were responsible for thousands of destroyed Soviet tanks. The number of crews lost is harder to pin down, but estimates place it at around 3 out of every 4 Soviet tankers never returning from the front. While mines, artillery, and other guns took their share, the 88 remained a leading cause of tank crew fatalities throughout the conflict. In the chaos of the final months, the 88 was everywhere. Dug into Berlin intersections, hidden in the ruins of Königsberg, guarding retreat routes through the Carpathians. It fought in its original role against Allied bombers over the Reich, then switched in moments to destroy Soviet armor pressing into German cities. In some sectors, a single gun crew held up entire battalions for hours. In others, they were wiped out before firing a shot. What made it so deadly was the combination of reach, precision, and power. The gun's optics and fire control systems allowed it to hit moving targets at distances where return fire was either inaccurate or impossible. Its shell velocity meant less lead time, fewer misses. And the psychological impact was devastating. Tank crews advancing under artillery fire could at least hear the incoming shells and try to react. The 88's flat trajectory gave no such warning. One moment, a T-34 was rolling forward. The next, it was a burning wreck. Even as the Red Army overwhelmed Germany with sheer numbers, the 88 never lost its ability to kill. But in the end, the math was unforgiving. A single gun could not stop dozens of tanks supported by infantry, artillery, and air power. For every ambush that succeeded, another was silenced in minutes. The weapon had reached the limit of what even the most lethal battlefield tool could achieve when the strategic situation had already collapsed. In the post-war years, many surviving 88s were scrapped. Some were displayed in military museums from Moscow to London. Others sold to countries in the Middle East or Africa, where they would see service in conflicts far removed from the snow and mud of the Eastern Front. For historians and enthusiasts, the gun remains a symbol of engineering excellence and battlefield adaptability. For veterans, it is a memory, sharp, cold, and unshakable. The story of the 88 is not just about steel and ballistics. It is about the men who served it, the men who faced it, and the countless who never saw it until it was too late. In a war defined by mass production and overwhelming firepower, this one weapon proved that a well-placed, well-handled gun could dominate the battlefield, even against impossible odds. And so, when we ask why 75% of Soviet tank crews never returned, the answer is complex. It involves tactics, terrain, weather, and logistics. But in every Soviet tanker's memory, there was one constant. Somewhere out there, hidden or in plain sight, was the long barrel of an 88mm gun, waiting for its moment. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you want to hear more untold stories of the weapons, battles, and people who shaped history.